The seed catalogue room opened each morning with the soft turning of a brass key and the quieter sigh of a door that had fitted its frame properly for almost 80 years. It was not a grand room, nor had anyone ever suggested that it ought to become one. It stood behind the potting sheds of the Bellwether Seed Company, beyond a narrow corridor where clean aprons hung from wooden pegs and a small clock advanced with an audible but unhurried tick. The room had 2 long tables, 6 straight-back chairs, a cast-iron radiator, and shelves that held the pleasant raw materials of winter work, folded catalogues, brown paper bands, boxes of envelopes, pencils sharpened at both ends, and cakes of string in the subdued colors favored by string. Mrs. Eleanor Vale arrived first on most mornings. She had been responsible for catalogue assembly for 23 seasons, which meant she could estimate the thickness of a stack of 50 catalogues by resting one hand upon it. This was not a trick she displayed at parties. It was simply the sort of knowledge that settled into the fingers when a task was repeated carefully for long enough. She placed her wool coat on the 3rd peg, because the 1st peg leaned and the 2nd was close to the radiator pipe. Then she opened the shutters one panel at a time. Winter light entered without enthusiasm. It spread across the tabletops in a pale rectangle, showing a few grains of paper dust and the faint marks left by last year's bundles. Outside, the nursery beds rested beneath low frames of glass. Nothing hurried there either. Labels stood in rows beside soil that looked empty but was merely waiting. The bare pear tree beside the wall carried 3 raindrops at the end of one twig. Mrs. Vale observed them for a moment, then turned toward the stove where a kettle had already been filled the previous evening. The Bellwether catalogue had once been 4 pages long. A copy from 1871 was kept in a shallow drawer lined with faded blue paper. It offered cabbages, onions, peas, beans, and 1 tomato described with caution as suitable for adventurous gardeners. By Mrs. Vale's time, the catalogue had grown to 48 pages, although page 48 contained mostly ordering instructions and the firm's address. Growth, in this case, was measured in varieties of letters and the gradual confidence with which the company discussed marrows. Each catalogue arrived from the printer folded but not yet banded. The covers were a soft cream color, neither white nor yellow, with a modest green border and a drawing of a watering can. The watering can had been redrawn 4 times in the company's history. The present version dated from 1912 and was considered satisfactory. Its handle formed a smooth oval, its rose had 14 visible holes, and the water pouring from it fell in 6 curved lines upon a row of seedlings that had never required thinning. Mrs. Vale lifted the top catalogue from the first stack and ran her thumb along the fold. A good fold made almost no sound. A poor fold crackled and sometimes showed a tiny ridge where one sheet had resisted the others. She set the good catalogue to her left and the poor one to her right. Poor did not mean unusable. It meant that later, after tea, someone would open it, smooth the pages, and persuade the fold to behave. Many things improved after tea and a little patient pressure. At 8:30, Mr. Pritchard came in carrying the address ledger. He was a narrow, cheerful man whose spectacles were always clean and whose cuffs were protected by grey cotton guards. The ledger was wider than his chest and bound in leather that had grown smooth at the corners. Every person who requested a Bellwether catalogue had a line in it. Some lines had continued through 3 generations at the same farmhouse. Others ended after 1 season with a small pencil note, moved, shop closed, or no garden now. Mr. Pritchard placed the ledger upon its own felt square. This square prevented the brass corners from marking the table and also gave the ledger an air of mild importance. He opened it to the letter A, where Abbott, Abernethy, and Acres waited in blue-black ink. Beside each name stood a street or village, a county, and a series of tiny marks showing which catalogues had been sent. The marks resembled a flock of orderly birds crossing a narrow field. The first task was to count the day's envelopes. Mrs. Vale preferred groups of 25. Mr. Pritchard preferred 50, but accepted 25 because the bundles sat more comfortably in the hand. They counted without speaking. The envelopes whispered against one another. At each 25th envelope, Mrs. Vale turned the final one sideways. For small bundles made 100, and 10 hundreds filled the green tray. The tray had a brass label that read addressed, although at this stage the envelopes were not addressed at all. Such inaccuracies sometimes survive because everyone understands them. The green tray had been used for addressed envelopes when it was purchased in 1894. Later the work had been rearranged, yet the label remained. A new employee might have found this confusing for a morning. By lunchtime, the tray's meaning became obvious. It held the envelopes that would, in due course, deserve the label. The Bellwether Company was not opposed to improvement, but it respected a serviceable tray. Miss Clara Wynne arrived next, bringing a packet of currant biscuits wrapped in waxed paper. She worked at the second table, where she copied addresses from the ledger in a round, even hand. Her capital G had a particularly restful curve. The firm's owner once proposed a mechanical addressing machine, but its demonstration model struck the table with every impression and caused the inkwell to tremble. The machine was returned. Miss Wynne's pen made no such disturbance. She filled the reservoir of her fountain pen, tested one line on scrap paper, and began with Mr. E. Abbott of Lower Mill Cottage. The nib moved from name to road, from road to village, and from village to county. She paused only to blot. The blotting paper was pink because pink blotting paper had been supplied for years. No one knew whether another color would work as well, and there seemed little urgency in finding out. Across from her, Mr. Pritchard read the names aloud at a pace established over many winters. He did not pronounce punctuation. He said, Edward Abbott, Lower Mill Cottage, West Bardun, Kent. Miss Wynne wrote the punctuation herself. When a place had an unusual spelling, he repeated it letter by letter, never with impatience. Some villages seemed to have been named by dropping a handful of consonants onto a map. Bellwether seeds nevertheless reached them. By 9 o'clock, the radiator had warmed sufficiently to release its familiar series of small metallic taps. 3 came close together, followed by a pause and a fourth. Mrs. Vale had listened to this pattern for so many years that its absence would have seemed louder than its presence. She poured tea into plain white cups. Each cup had a green line near the rim. Mr. Pritchard's line was interrupted by a chip, but the chip had been sanded smooth and no longer troubled anyone. They drank without leaving their chairs. The catalogue room did not require strict silence, but it encouraged voices to settle. Miss Wynne reported that the road near her house had received a new layer of gravel. Mr. Pritchard said he had noticed the gravel and believed it to be of a sensible size. Mrs. Vale mentioned that the nursery cat had chosen a different sack to sleep on. These observations were considered in turn and did not lead to disagreement. After tea, the banding began. A catalogue was placed cover upward, aligned with the table edge, and wrapped with a strip of brown paper. The strip met at the back, where a small brush applied gum from a shallow pot. The gum smelled faintly of almonds and damp cardboard. Mrs. Vale pressed the overlap with 2 fingers, counted to 3, and set the catalogue beneath a wooden weight. The weight was a polished block of beech with a handle on top. It had no decorative purpose, yet years of handling had made it beautiful in the undemanding manner of useful things. 5 weight stood in a row. When the 6th catalogue was ready, the first weight could be removed because its band had set. This produced a cycle of modest perfection: wrap, brush, press, wait, move, wrap, brush, press, wait, move. The hands learned the distance between each object. The brush returned to the same hollow in its pot. The paper strips waited with their gummed ends facing away from the sleeve. The work occupied attention without asking it to become excited. The band served 2 purposes. They kept the catalogue closed in transit and provided a firm surface for the address label. In earlier years, string had been used. String looked pleasant but caught on sorting racks and required a knot. The company's minute book recorded the transition to bands in 1906. The entry consisted of 7 lines, including a note that 2 directors favored string for appearance. The bands won by 1 vote and had continued winning quietly ever since. At the far end of the room, Miss Wynne cut address labels from sheets. Each sheet contained 12 rectangles separated by pale dotted rules. She used a broad-bladed pair of scissors whose loops had been wrapped in black cloth. The cloth made long cutting easier and gave the scissors the dignified look of a tool prepared for winter. She cut the horizontal lines first, making strips, then the vertical lines, making labels. The offcuts fell into a basket and curled there like narrow shavings of snow. No label was attached until its catalogue had passed inspection. Mrs. Vale checked the cover, the band, and the number of pages. Missing pages were rare, but page 32 had once appeared twice in an entire delivery, causing page 33 to vanish. The duplication was discovered because a description of cucumbers was followed by the same description of cucumbers. Mrs. Vale had nothing against cucumbers, but repetition without purpose was not part of the catalogue's design. She checked page numbers by fanning the lower corners. 48 numbers passed beneath her thumb in a grey flicker. The paper carried the dry, comfortable smell of fresh printing. Dark green ink appeared nearly black in the morning light. Illustrations of peas, beans, beets, and modestly triumphant cauliflowers occupied small panels between the columns. The vegetables had been drawn from specimens but improved slightly in posture. 1 cauliflower illustration had been used since 1888. It showed a round head beneath 5 broad leaves. During a catalogue revision, someone suggested replacing it with a more modern cauliflower. The artist produced a new drawing, but the new cauliflower leaned to the right in a way the directors found unnecessarily energetic. The old illustration returned. Customers continued ordering cauliflower seed, apparently untroubled by the age of the portrait. The catalogue's language had also settled over time. Peas were reliable, carrots were fine-rooted, cabbages were dependable, and radishes were quick. Superlatives were rare. A marrow might be called excellent, but only after several seasons of evidence. Bellwether's customers did not need their vegetables to be astonishing. They wanted them to germinate where planted, remain recognizable, and reach the kitchen in a condition suitable for soup. Near 11, a cart rolled into the yard with the second delivery from the printer. Its wheels passed over the cobbles slowly because the driver knew the middle row was uneven. Through the window, the workers watched 2 men carry in square bundles tied with cotton tape. The bundles were placed beside the door until Mrs. Vale could check the delivery note. There were 18 bundles of 200 catalogues each, plus 1 bundle of 100, making 3,700 in all. Mrs. Vale counted the bundles twice, not because she distrusted the printer but because counting was the bridge between a number on paper and a number in a room. On the first count, there were 18 large and 1 small. On the second, there were still 18 large and 1 small. She signed the note with the date and added the time, 11 minutes past 11, although the form did not request the time. It was useful to know when things had become certain. The cotton tapes were untied rather than cut. Cut tape became short tape, while untied tape remained long enough to be useful. Miss Wynne wound each length around for fingers, slipped the coil free, and tucked the end beneath itself. The coils went into the tape drawer. The tape drawer contained white tape, cream tape, and tape that had once been white but had spent long enough in service to become undecided. The top catalogue from each bundle was examined for ink and trimming. Printers called these make-ready checks, though the catalogue room simply called them checks. Mrs. Vale compared the green border against a sample kept beneath glass. She measured the margin with a little steel rule. She rubbed one corner with a clean handkerchief to ensure the ink had dried. It had. The water ink and remained centered. The 14 holes in its rows were present. The new delivery was accepted. At noon, work stopped for luncheon. The radiator continued its tapping, no longer needing an audience. Mrs. Vale ate bread with cheese and a small apple. Mr. Pritchard had soup in a jar wrapped with flannel, and Miss Wynne divided the currant biscuits into 3 equal groups, which required 1 biscuit to be broken. She broke it carefully and gave herself the smaller half because she had performed the division. They spoke about seed names. The catalogue listed a lettuce called Winter Density, a bin called Painted Lady, and a pea called Telephone. Mr. Pritchard said telephone was an odd name for a pea because peas did not improve conversation. Miss Wynne observed that a row of peas might nevertheless carry news from one end of a garden to the other, though the news would probably concern rain. Mrs. Vale considered this and said the messages would be very green. After luncheon, they inspected returned catalogues. The post office sent these back in a canvas sack with reasons marked in pencil. Gone away was common. Not known appeared with a severity that seemed excessive for a seed catalogue. House empty had a lonely tone, while deceased caused Mr. Pritchard to remove his spectacles and make a small mark in the ledger. Names left the list quietly. No one announced the change. A line was drawn, a date was entered, and the catalogue was set aside for its ban to be reused if possible. Occasionally, an address changed only slightly. Rose Cottage became Rosebank Cottage, or a village acquired a postal district. Mr. Pritchard amended the ledger in red ink. He disliked erasing because erased paper looked uncertain. A red correction told the whole truth: this was once the address, and now it is this. The ledger became a map not only of places but of adjustments, each one narrow enough to fit between ruled lines. Some customers wrote requests on postcards. Please send catalogue. New garden. Interested in sweet peas. The messages arrived in many hands, sloping, upright, crowded, generous, or formed in capital letters throughout. Miss Wynne arranged the cards alphabetically before passing them to Mr. Pritchard. He entered each name and assigned it the next catalogue mark. A person could join the bellwether list with 9 words and a halfpenny stamp. The company saved unusual stamps for the owner's nephew, who collected them. Common stamps stayed on the cards. Removing every stamp would have taken time and steam, and no one required a large collection of ordinary brown kings. When a stamp from overseas appeared, Mrs. Vale dampened the corner of a cloth and laid it over the paper until the gum softened. The stamp lifted without protest and dried face down upon the blotter. One winter, a postcard came from a lighthouse keeper on a small island. He requested hardy cabbage and asked whether sea wind affected germination. Bellwether's head gardener wrote a careful reply explaining that germination occurred beneath the soil but young leaves might need shelter. The lighthouse keeper remained on the list for 12 years. Each catalogue traveled by train, mail steamer, and a final boat, carrying its quiet pictures of inland vegetables across water the color of slate. At 2, sunlight reached the shelf of order books. It warmed their faded spines and revealed titles written in gold: Spring 1919, Autumn 1919, Spring 1920. The gold had vanished from frequently touched letters. Each volume contained carbon copies of orders, notes about shortages, and substitutions approved by customers. The books were not needed for catalogue assembly, yet their presence gave the room a sense of continuity. Every winter had left a book behind. Mrs. Vale opened one at random and found an order for 3 packets of leek seed, 1 ounce of broad beans, and a request to omit all flowers. The customer had underlined all. Perhaps flowers had disappointed them, or perhaps their garden was entirely practical. Bellwether had fulfilled the order without inquiry. A garden could be practical, decorative, or mostly path. The catalogue offered possibilities but did not insist. The afternoon's work involved inserting the annual order form. This was a single sheet of thinner paper folded once. It had boxes for quantity, variety number, price, and remarks. The form slid beneath the center pages of each catalogue with its top edge aligned to the fold. If inserted too far, it disappeared. If not far enough, it protruded and caught beneath the band. The correct position left half an inch visible, a small white promise that ordering could occur. Mr. Pritchard prepared forms in groups of 50. He tapped their lower edges against the table, turned them, tapped the side, and placed them under a flat board. Paper behaved better after alignment. Its corners agreed with one another. Its edges formed a single pale surface. The board prevented the stack from relaxing into disorder while he reached for the next group. Miss Wynne inserted, Mrs. Vale banded, Mr. Pritchard labeled. The 3 motions joined without instruction. A finished catalogue traveled down the table in stages, never fast and never waiting long. At the end, it entered a mail sack whose mouth was held open by a simple wooden frame. The sack slowly changed shape, first flat, then rounded, then agreeably full. Each catalogue inside belonged to a particular person, even though the sack made them look collective. Address labels were attached with paste. The paste was made each Monday and kept in a covered pot. By Thursday it grew thicker, which some workers preferred. Mrs. Vale did not express a preference so long as it held the label flat. Mr. Pritchard brushed paste from the center outward, leaving the corners until last. A corner missed by the brush could rise during travel. A raised corner could catch another label. This would not bring ruin, but it could create avoidable untidiness, and the catalogue room had been established largely to prevent avoidable untidiness. When a label was fixed, he read it once more against the ledger. Then he drew a tiny tick beside the catalogue mark. This tick was the smallest completed task in the room. It showed no detail about folding, banding, checking, inserting, pasting, or reading. It simply meant done. Thousands of minutes of work became a field of ticks, each leaning forward by the same slight angle. The mail sacks carried brass tags for destination sorting. County names were stamped in capital letters. Kent went with Kent, Sussex with Sussex, and uncertain addresses into a smaller tray for later consideration. The workers knew many towns by postal route rather than geography. A village could be north on a map yet travel south first because the railway sorting office required it. The catalogue followed the system, which was rarely the straightest line and usually the reliable one. Outside, a gardener crossed the yard with a wheelbarrow of clean pots. The pots knocked softly together as the barrow passed. In summer the yard rang with hoses, crates, and customers' footsteps. Winter reduced it to smaller sounds, a broom on brick, a latch closing, the distant scrape of a shovel turning compost. The catalogue room belonged to this quieter season. While the beds rested, paper gardens travelled outward. At 3, the kettle was filled again. This time Miss Wynne made the tea. She warmed the pot with a little water, emptied it into the sink, added 3 spoonfuls of leaves and 1 for the pot, then poured. Mr. Pritchard said the extra spoonful for the pot was an old custom. Mrs. Vale replied that the pot had never yet thanked them, but it did produce good tea. They agreed that gratitude was not required from crockery. The afternoon biscuit was plain. Currant biscuits were reserved for morning because currants gave the impression of considerable refreshment. The plain biscuits left fewer crumbs on the ledger. Each worker held a small plate beneath the biscuit while eating. 1 crumb fell upon the table, and Miss Wynne lifted it with a damp fingertip. It joined the other crumbs in a saucer that would later be carried to the yard for sparrows. The sparrows had learned the catalogue schedule. At 3:30, several appeared along the windowsill and looked inward with the brisk impatience of creatures who did not work with paper. Mrs. Vale did not feed them immediately. A regular system had to remain regular. At 4, when the final teacups were washed, she scattered the crumbs beside the pear tree. The sparrows descended as if a notice had been posted. Before then, there was the matter of damaged covers. A small stack had acquired bent upper corners during delivery. Mrs. Vale placed each catalogue beneath a sheet of clean board and pressed the corner with a warm iron. The iron was small, made for cuffs, and heated on the stove. She tested it on scrap paper first. Too much heat polished the ink, too little did nothing. At the correct warmth, the fibers softened and the corner lay flat again. Mr. Pritchard called this ironing the vegetables. Miss Wynne pointed out that only the pictures of vegetables were being ironed. Mrs. Vale said the distinction was important because actual cabbage responded poorly to heat and less supper was intended. The conversation ended there, having reached a complete and useful conclusion. By late afternoon, the addressed sacks stood in 2 rows. Each was weighed on the platform scale near the door. The scale had a black iron base and a brass pointer that trembled before settling. Mr. Pritchard added small weights to the balance arm, 5 pounds, 2 pounds, 1 pound, then ounces. He recorded the total on a dispatch card. When a sack exceeded the preferred weight, 6 catalogues were moved to the next sack, which always seemed relieved to receive them. The scale was inspected every October by the county weights officer. He brought polished standard weights in a wooden case lined with green felt. He set them upon the platform and watched the pointer. If the pointer rested at 0, he made a mark on a certificate. The visit took 12 minutes when all was well. It once took 27 because dust had gathered beneath a lever. The dust was removed, the lever moved freely, and balance returned. Mrs. Vale liked the scale because it made no guesses. A sack might feel heavy after luncheon or light on a cold morning, but the pointer was unaffected by appetite or weather. It trembled, considered, and stopped. The number then belonged in the dispatch book, where sacks were listed by date, destination, weight, and porter. Nothing in the book described the contents as hopeful, colorful, or spring-like. They were catalogues, and they weighed what they weighed. The porter arrived at 20 minutes past 4. His name was Samuel Reed, and he wore a cap with a peak made shiny by rain. He signed for the sacks, counted the brass tags, and loaded them onto a low trolley. The trolley's left wheel squeaked once per turn. Mr. Reed had oiled it several times, but the squeak returned after damp days. It was not loud enough to justify replacement. It accompanied him across the yard like a small mechanical bird. One sack remained behind because its address tag had a loose rivet. Mr. Pritchard could have tied the tag with string, but the dispatch rules specified a fixed tag. He carried it to the maintenance bench, selected a brass rivet from a drawer, and tapped it closed with a light hammer. 3 taps were enough. The first seated it, the second tightened it, and the third was perhaps unnecessary but traditional. The sack joined the trolley. Mr. Reed wheeled the load toward the gate, where a horse waited between the shafts of the mail cart. The horse was called Fern and had no opinion about seed catalogues. Her breath formed slow clouds in the cooling air. The sacks were placed beneath a canvas cover. Buckles were fastened. Mr. Reed climbed to the seat, clicked his tongue once, and the cart moved away with the reasonable sound of iron rims on cobbles. For a few moments, the catalogue room seemed larger. The full sacks had occupied space and expectation. Now only the empty wooden frames remained. Mrs. Vale folded them and leaned them beside the wall. Miss Wynne gathered the label offcuts. Mr. Pritchard closed the ledger after placing a ribbon at the next name. The room turned from production to preparation, which was a gentler version of the same work. They counted what remained for morning: 920 catalogues, 874 order forms, 6 full pots of gum, 1 partial pot of paste, and enough bands for approximately 2 days. Approximately was acceptable for bands because a new box stood unopened in the supply cupboard. Mrs. Vale wrote these numbers on the slate. Chalk made a soft grainy sound and left dust along the lower frame. The supply cupboard was inspected every Friday. Its shelves held paper bands by width, gum brushes by size, sealing wax no longer used, spare nibs, blotters, wrapping paper, ledger ribbon, and 2 boxes labeled miscellaneous. Mrs. Vale believed miscellaneous things should be kept in small boxes so they did not become ambitious. The first box contained paper clips, a cork, and a key without a known lock. The second held 3 labels printed with an old address. No one discarded the old labels. The company had moved from Market Lane to Nursery Road in 1891, making the address wrong for more than 30 years. Still, the labels were well printed on strong paper. They could be used to test paste, compare typefaces, or show a new employee how the old address looked. Usefulness sometimes waited a long time for its particular moment. Miss Wynne washed the paste brushes in warm water. She stroked each brush against the bottom of the basin until the water ran clear, then shaped the bristles with her fingers and laid it flat to dry. A brush left standing upright while wet allowed water into the handle. This caused swelling. Swelling caused cracks. Cracks led eventually to the supply cupboard, where cracked brushes waited for rougher tasks. Care postponed this modest decline. Mr. Pritchard wiped his pen and capped the ink. He examined the nib beneath the lamp, found a thread of paper caught in its split, and removed it with the corner of a card. The nib flashed briefly. It had written 312 addresses that day. Tomorrow it would begin with Mrs. A. Lomax of Greenbank Farm, whose catalogue mark waited at the top of the next ledger page. Mrs. Vale covered the gum pots, returned the wooden weights to their shelf, and aligned the chairs beneath the tables. She did not insist that chair backs form a perfect line, but they tended to do so. Work repeated with care leaves shapes behind. The brush lies where the hand expects it. The ledger rests within the felt square. The chair finds the worn place in the floorboards. Outside the window, the last light had withdrawn from the nursery frames. Their panes reflected the room now, 3 figures moving slowly, shelves of folded paper, and the round white face of the clock. Beyond the reflection, the beds were dark and still. Seeds waited in tins inside the warehouse. Soil waited beneath glass. Gardeners across the counties had not yet received the catalogues that would ask them to imagine rows of beans in January. The first catalogues from the morning were already traveling. Some rested in mailbags at the station. Some crossed the county behind Fern. One would go to the lighthouse island. Another would arrive at a narrow house with a garden no wider than a carpet. Another might sit unopened on a mantelpiece for a week, gathering a little dust before someone turned down the corner of the page. None of this required the catalogue room to know. Its work ended at the dispatch book. The later gardens belonged to weather, soil, patience, slugs, and all the other committees that decide a seed's future. The room dealt in folds, labels, bands, and correct addresses. It prepared possibility in packages weighing a few ounces each. At 5, Miss Wynne put on her coat and wrapped the remaining biscuits. Mr. Pritchard lifted the ledger with both hands and carried it to the locked cabinet. Mrs. Vale checked the stove, the windows, the cupboard, and the side door. She lowered the shutters one panel at a time. Each panel covered a strip of the dark yard until only the room remained. The clock ticked. The radiator gave one last tap. Mrs. Vale turned down the lamp and stood for a moment in the dimness, where the cream catalogue covers became pale squares upon the tables. There would be more names tomorrow, more order forms to align, more bands to brush and press beneath the beech weights. The work had not concluded. It had merely reached the comfortable fold between one day and the next. She closed the door and turned the brass key. In the corridor, the aprons hung without movement. The key went into the small pocket inside her glove. Then she walked toward the yard, where the air smelled of wet brick and resting soil, while behind her the seed catalogues waited in their patient stacks, the watering cans upon their covers pouring 6 quiet green lines forever downward, onto seedlings that would remain exactly that size through the long and uneventful night.